Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Gaming in the Wild, a video games podcast about games from the creative, artistic side of the tracks, from indie to AAA. My name's John, I'm your host. I'm a journalist based out in Reykjavik, Iceland, where tonight there's a funny atmosphere out in the town. Actually, I've noticed. You know how some nights you just get a feeling that something's going on. It's hard to describe, really. It's like a full moon feeling. There's cars going past with like loud music bumping and bass and stuff, and there's like a kind of slightly more vibrant kind of street conversation than usual. I don't know. It feels like a Friday night or like a full moon when people are kind of up for it somehow. But I'm here recording the podcast a little early. I'm recording on a Wednesday today. I normally record on a Thursday night or a Friday. But the reason that I'm recording early is because of the games that I'm going to talk about today. They are a little bit unusual in many ways, but they are such a complicated kind of conceptual head full of game that I felt like I had to talk about them right after I played them, before I played anything else, because I felt like my thoughts about the game were just going to float away unless I got them down quickly. They are two games by Davey Wreden. I think I'm saying that right, his surname. He's an American dev that started off as an amateur dev making mods and stuff like that and playing around. But one of his mods went viral and became a big success, and that was the Stanley Parable. He then made a follow-up to that game later on called The Beginner's Guide, and both of them are absolutely fascinating games, so I'm really excited to talk about them today. I will also mention before we get started that I did start a Patreon for the show recently, try and generate a bit of income to keep the lights on over here, buy myself some games and things like that, and keep the show running. So if you are enjoying Gaming in the Wild, if you're a regular listener, or if you're a new listener even, and you enjoy the show, you are welcome to head over to patreon.com/gaminginthewild, where you can sign up for as little as $3 a month and get bonus episodes about off-topic conversations, spoiler casts and things like that, as well as text content such as eShop store recommendations. I'll be combing through the eShop sales every week and posting up a couple of recommendations for my patrons from the back catalogue of games that have been covered on the show. So if that's something that sounds interesting to you, if you'd like a little bit of extra exclusive patron content, something nice to listen to, and some notifications of some cool games that you can get for a bargain price, then it's patreon.com/gaminginthewild. So thank you very much for anyone that considers doing that. It's a really big help to me and I appreciate it greatly. Thanks also to Reagan Kelly and Angela Rawlings, my first two patrons. And without further ado, let's dive right in and start talking about the Stanley Parable. That little cutout there in the music where you have this kind of orchestral sweep that is suddenly shattered by a second of silence and then a big piano chime is very typical of what you can expect from the Stanley Parable. It's a game that thrives on the unexpected, that delights in confounding your expectations, that steps way out of the boundaries of what you might consider to be a normal game framework. And in doing so, it kind of puts forward a really confrontational philosophy about your relationship as a gamer to the game that you are experiencing. It all starts innocuously enough. There is a short intro about Stanley. Stanley is a man that works in an office, and his job is to punch numbers into a keyboard. The numbers appear on the screen. He punches the numbers in, and he is happy. That's the whole premise of the game. But one day, Stanley is at work, and he realizes that he's been sitting at his desk for hours. No numbers have appeared on the screen, and he doesn't know what to do. This is told to us by a narrator who has like a kind of glorious theatrical English actor accent. He's voiced by an actor called Kevin Brighting, who just does an absolutely stellar job on this game. He kind of sounds like a butler. He's like, Stanley came into the office and was confounded to see that there was no one there. So this is the narrator that we're dealing with, and the narrator is a big character in the Stanley Parable and a big part of what makes it special. As Stanley wanders through the office, looking around to see what's going on, he realizes that no one is there. No one is at their desks. No one is in their cubicles. The office is abandoned. So right away we've gotten a sense of the uncanny, that something is off, that something is wrong. And the game is going to use that and play with it and take it kind of to the nth degree. You can walk around as Stanley. You can interact with a couple of things. You can try doors. Most of them are locked. You can try and activate a computer, see what happens. There's a couple of things you can interact with, but mostly the narrator urges you forward. He says Stanley went to the meeting room, and so you do. You walk forward, and you end up in a room with 2 doors. And this is the real root of the game. Davey Wreden has said in interviews that this room that you arrive in was the seed of the idea that led to the whole game. Stanley is confronted by 2 doors, one on the left and one on the right. And the narrator says, Stanley went through the left-hand door and headed for the meeting room. And so you have a choice as a gamer. You're like, what am I going to do here? Am I going to go with the narrator who seems to be kind of prescribing what Stanley is going to do? Or am I going to diverge from the narrator's story and go through the right-hand door? And I think a lot of gamers, including me, we have an urge to kind of test the limits of a game when we first start playing. I remember the interview that I mentioned in the Short Hike episode that Adam Robinson Yu gave about the game. And he described how players behaved in ways that he didn't expect, that players would, rather than taking the coastal road that is really obvious in a short hike, obviously you're meant to go down that road. You're even told that that's the way. A lot of players would realize that they could swim and just swim out into the ocean and keep swimming and go to the back of the island and get lost. And then he had to actually put tunnels in the mountain to try and get people back on track because players respond so differently to games. And so the Stanley Parable is recognizing this urge to test the limits and break the game and presenting it as an option. And this is all in the first 2 minutes of the game. So it did occur to me when I was thinking about this podcast that it's going to be very hard to talk about the Stanley Parable and the Beginner's Guide without spoilers. So I'm looking at the stopwatch on the recording now, and I'm at 8 minutes exactly, and I'm kind of surprised that I managed to get this far without delivering any spoilers. It really is quite a tough game to talk about, to analyze, without going into plot detail. So I'm going to try and outline what the game is for you in a spoiler-free way, for those of you who might want to try it. And then I think this is going to be one of those shows where there kind of has to be a spoiler break, because that's just the kind of game that the Stanley Parable is. So what I've just explained to you about the narrative, you have a narrator who's delivering a kind of prescribed narrative, and then you as a player can choose to diverge from it. And the choices that you make will lead to a wide variety of outcomes. The game delights in pulling the rug out from under your feet as a player. It delights in breaking the fourth wall. That's like the theatre term for, in case you've not heard it, it's just the theatre term for the invisible wall that exists between the stage and the audience that we pretend isn't there. But the Stanley Parable delights in breaking that wall, in recognizing and kind of admitting what it is as a game, and of kind of challenging you as a player to kind of shake off that passivity, that kind of unspoken relationship that normally exists between the player and the game, the unspoken kind of contract that the game is there to entertain you, that it's going to make sense, that it's going to offer some kind of narrative, and that you as a player are going to interact with it and move through it, and that you're going to do so in a kind of a partnership. It's not something that we think about a lot, you know. Most of it comes naturally. Like you pick up Mario Kart. Mario Kart's there to entertain you. You race around and it's like thrills and spills and missiles and chaos and winning and losing and laughing. And that's what the game is for. The Stanley Parable is not for that. The Stanley Parable is something else entirely. It's a commentary on that gameness that we take for granted. And that's what makes it special. It's very smart, it's very self-aware, it's at times chaotic, it's laugh out loud funny. I've never laughed so much and so often playing a game. It is profound, it is ridiculous, it trolls you as a player, it lures you into a false sense of security, it breaks your expectations. It's an artwork, it's an interactive artwork as much as it is a game. It's a comment about games as much as it is a game. I think the closest reference point that I can think of is two musicians that I really like. They do the same thing. So they are both in the folk bracket loosely, but they both absolutely destroy the template of what we think that means. There's an artist called Sam Amidon and an artist called David Thomas Broughton. And when we watch folk musicians, you know, it's pin drop quiet. The audience sits and is attentive. The musician performs, usually sounds pretty, you know, it's the singer-songwriter style. But Sam and David both perform absolute mischief. They vandalize that situation. Sam will jump off the stage, run around. He'll start making ridiculous sounds with his mouth like a police car. He'll drive the song off the rails and gleefully destroy it. David does a similar thing. He'll detune his own guitar. He will move two amplifiers together to create feedback and then sit cross-legged in the middle of the audience, singing off mic and improvising and beatboxing. And then before you know it, he's back on the stage and he is playing something heartbreakingly beautiful. And he has woken you up from your kind of audience slumber in a way that could be considered obnoxious or could be considered artistic and could be considered interesting. Whether or not you like the sound of that maybe will define whether or not you like the Stanley Parable. It's definitely a Marmite kind of game. There are going to be people that love it. There are going to be people that hate it. But in this case, I firmly believe that it's worth the risk. So that's the Stanley Parable. It's a game about choice, it's a game about games, it's a game about narratives. Managed to get through talking about it without going into the spoiler cast. So I think I'll just run down a little bit of interesting info about that game and see where we end up. So Davey Wreden made this game when he was 22 years old, and he made it as a Half-Life 2 mod. So it was just an extension of that game system. But I'm not quite sure exactly how it happened, but this mod became insanely popular. It went viral. It had 90,000 downloads. And so, you know, it became news in the gamer community. Then Davey Wreden was given offers to produce the game as a standalone game. And by 2013, this was in 2011 that the mod was made. And then in 2013, He worked with a UK coder called Gareth Pugh, and they released the Stanley Parable. I believe in some kind of partnership with Valve, but I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it was the Steam Greenlight or something like that. I don't know. I don't know the ins and outs. This is during my fallow period, so I'm not filled in on what was going on in games at that time. But the Stanley Parable sold 100,000 copies in 3 days, which is just crazy for an indie game, especially at that time. And within a year, it had sold 1 million copies. So this game is a renowned indie game, a viral smash hit game, basically. And it's still very short. I mean, I have played 2.5 hours, and I have seen several outcomes, and there is still more to play. I believe the game's quite cheap. Wait a second, I can just jump off mic and pause it and know the price by magic. It's $14.99, and you can get it in a bundle with the Beginner's Guide, which is the spiritual successor of this game, not a direct sequel, but just what Davey did next, for $22.49. But if you're not a Steam kind of person, I know a lot of people that listen to the podcast are more concerned with PlayStation 4 and Switch. There is some interesting news because an Ultra Deluxe console edition of the game was due to be released this year. It was recently announced that it's been pushed back to 2021. But that's really interesting because when the game evolved from the original mod into the standalone Steam version, it was quite extensively rethought and reimagined. And so it's, I'm not sure if this is going to be a port or if this is going to be a reimagining for a console audience. But either way, the Ultra Deluxe edition of the Stanley Parable is due on consoles in 2021. If you are intrigued by the sound of this game, there is a demo that you can download for free on Steam. And it was made specifically, it's standalone, it's not a part of the game. It's to illustrate the concept of the game. So you can download that for free and you can give it a try. I think I'm going to leave talking about the Stanley Parable here. And I think I'm going to let this podcast be what it is. And I'm going to do a spoiler cast for my patrons, actually. So you don't have to skip forward or bail on the podcast. But if you do want to hear more about the Stanley Parable, I'm going to make a partner podcast for this and put it on Patreon. So if you've played the game already, or if you play it and you want to process it, it's that kind of game, then check out Patreon, patreon.com/gaminginthewild, and I think across the next week, I'll post a spoiler cast there. So there we go. That's it. It's a really interesting one. I guess you can probably tell from a different tone to usual. This game really excited me. This game really tickled me. I found it to be a fascinating experience. It's one of my favourite things that I've played this year. I think for all of the good quality games that I've played, this one is just so confounding, unique and surprising that it's a game that I'll just never forget playing, which I guess is extremely high recommendation in itself. So there we go. That's the Stanley Parable. The Beginner's Guide is described as the spiritual successor to the Stanley Parable, same developer, cut from the same cloth, but a very different proposition nonetheless. This game goes even more metafictional in that Davey Wreden now, as well as being the developer, has become our narrator. And the game begins with an empty test level. I think it's from, Counter-Strike or something like that. It's like a user-created level. And Davey explains that it's the first game that was made by an amateur developer called Coda, who he met at a game jam. And he thinks that Coda is great. He thinks that Coda is underrated, underappreciated, maybe lacks confidence. And so by showing us all of Coda's work, starting at the very beginning, that maybe he can convince Coda to start making games again. And so Davey walks us through the level. He points out some features, and that's pretty much it. A few minutes later, we move on to the next level, and Davey said, "Here we can see a development in Coda's work." And so he talks us through some levels that Coda has made, some kind of just environments that you can walk around that have quirks. And Davey starts to draw a picture of an interpretation of what Coda's MO is, what his the psychology that lies behind his designs is, and he starts to kind of draw an image in our mind of what kind of person Coda is. And there isn't much more that I can say about this one without spoiling it. It's, I think the Stanley Parable is very much about surprises, and that's why I only talked in the broadest possible terms about the Stanley Parable, so as not to spoil it for you. And the beginner's guide is even more difficult to talk about without spoilers. So if you haven't played the game, then maybe now is the time to drop out. Thanks for listening. You can skip ahead to 30 minutes and 30 seconds if you want to skip the spoilers. If you have played the game, then listen on, because now that we're post-spoiler break, I can say that Davey narrates this game in the grand tradition of the unreliable narrator, and we only learn that as we go. So as he talks more and more about Coda, it starts to feel more like he's a little obsessed with Coda, and we start to realize that maybe he isn't quite the innocuous champion of Coda that he has set himself up to be at the start of the game. He definitely gets more and more obsessive. He definitely takes the work and paints a picture of Coda as a person that seems a little bit intense, a little bit misguided. He's attributing thoughts that he has about the work to Coda's kind of mental state and things like that. And as the game progresses, I felt genuinely uncomfortable the further that we got into it. Davey's performance, and it is a performance, is incredibly well judged. And as we get to the end of the game, the final levels they get darker, they get more difficult, the imagery gets more negative. There's a stage with a intimidating, empty concert hall that makes you feel very naked, and then there is like a kind of a press gauntlet that you have to run through with Coda as a broken machine locked away in a dark room. And then finally there is just an inaccessible cold tower. And Davey explains how the tower level is actually broken. There is no way to complete it. In one part there is an invisible maze that kills you, so you can't even see the walls. And so Davey inserts a bridge into the game and says, "I've inserted a bridge so you can get through it." He takes us to an antechamber with a door that is unopenable, literally hacks the game and lets you through it, because these are the avant-garde gestures that Coda is apparently making in his games at this point, which Davey said is a sign of depression, a sign of withdrawing from the public, of erecting barriers between him and his audience. And it turns out the twist in the tale of the beginner's guide is that once we've moved through the invisible maze and the unopenable door, Coda has left a museum exhibit of text telling Davey to stop contacting him, to stop interpreting his games, to stop over-interpreting and sharing his games without his permission. And so we realize that Davey is in fact an obsessive fan who has alienated this game maker who might well have just been messing around with code, making levels for fun. And so we're put in this really strange situation. And I felt genuinely kind of touched by this. Like I felt uncomfortable, I felt queasy. Like the game had just made this really kind of toxic situation, an awkward situation, and brought it to life in a way that is very much like a kind of a one-man theatre performance, where it starts off nice, but everything is wrong. This game had a unusual reaction from the audience. It's a work of trolling and just performance art from the developer, basically. He initially refused to disclose whether or not Coda was real. Some people took it as real because of the kind of documentary style of the game. And if it had been real, then it would have been really unethical to release this game. And so I think Davey got a bit of hate mail because of that, from the sounds of things. But he has, across time, admitted that Coda doesn't exist. He's done a couple of interviews about it, very few. I found one on a dev podcast called Tone Control. You can go and dig that one out. There's an episode where Davey is interviewed and he gives quite a frank interview about this. The interviewer, quite understandably, has assumed that this is in some way autobiographical, because Davey had apparently a fairly public meltdown after the success of the Stanley Parable, which sounds really difficult, and perhaps processed some of those feelings into this quite disturbing game, where the relationship between player, developer, and public is distorted and troubled, that the developer has very unfair expectations and interpretations kind of projected onto them. And so I think it's fair to assume that some of that might be what was going on with Davey. But the metafictional kind of challenge of this game is that even by saying that, we are engaging in the kind of presumptuous personal interpretation that the game is seeming to actively discourage. And so we are kind of placed unwittingly in the seat of the villain in this game. The player becomes the villain, especially by talking about it the way that I am now. So the game is a little bit about how an artist's work is not representative of the artist and how you should not project onto the artist. And yet at the very same time, it seems to offer that autobiographical way into what the game is really about. So it's paradoxical, difficult, challenging. Hard to say that it's enjoyable, but it is certainly worth playing if this kind of theatrical prank of a game sounds intriguing to you. Then it's definitely worth a spin. I would say start with the Stanley Parable, start with the demo. If you like the demo, if you like the vibe, then play that game. If you end up loving the Stanley Parable, then go for the beginner's guide. If the Stanley Parable isn't your cup of tea, then the beginner's guide definitely won't be. So before I wrap up talking about these two games, that Tone Control interview did have one quote that caught my attention. I will put a link to that interview in the show notes. Wreden has said that the aim of the Stanley Parable was to mess with the player's head in every way possible, throwing them off guard, pretending there's an answer, and then whisking it away in front of them. So the Stanley Parable is definitely an active act of trolling. The beginner's guide does a very different thing. It uses some of those same mechanics, but it's not playful like the Stanley Parable is. The Stanley Parable is a bit dark. The narrator definitely is aiming to mess with your head a little bit. It's a bit Truman Show-esque. It definitely places some stressors on you. The narrator kind of bullies you, castigates you a little. I would say, it's a challenging game, but it's nothing compared to the beginner's guide, which really does put a lot of stress on the player. It's not your average game that puts you into an ethically compromised position whilst you've literally just been sitting there playing the game that has been laid out for you. It's almost like a trap. But as we're hitting the 30-minute mark, I think that's what I wanted to say about these two games. That is the beginner's guide. So that's the Stanley Parable and the Beginner's Guide. Two very engaging games. I did also play a couple of others though. I played a game called Lost Ember. You might have seen it if you paid any attention to the last Nintendo Mini Direct. It's an indie game made by a 5-man team called Moon Eye Studios. And I was really attracted to it from the trailer. It's a game where you start off as a wolf and you run through a natural world, and you have the ability to spirit wander, which means that you can leap from animal to animal, species to species. So you can become a parrot, you can become a stampeding buffalo, you can become a flitting hummingbird, you can become a wombat that can crawl into burrows and find hidden collectibles and things like that. So I was really excited about this game. I was given a review code for it to write about it for Nintendo World Report, and that review is live now. I will post a link to it in the show notes. And the review, kind of, to make a long story short, kind of says that whilst the game is fun and innovative in several ways, it's really technically messed up. I had a couple of hard crashes. I had a lot of death loops where I fell off something and then was regenerated in a place where I fell off again. And so it was just like die, respawn, die, respawn, die, respawn, and had to reset it. So it's a real shame, but I was tweeting about the game as I was playing, and to their credit, the devs got in touch on Twitter and said, we're working on a patch, we know it's in need of one. So I'm actually going to send them the videos that I captured of my crashes, and hopefully they can make a better version of it, because at the core, it's quite a compelling game, it has a good story, and that central mechanic is really fun. I've also been playing the Ori series. So I played Blind Forest because Switch Indie Fix asked me if I'd be up for reviewing Will of the Wisps, and I've been sitting on Blind Forest for a long time and just not gotten around to it. So I tried to play Blind Forest and got, I got the achievement for halfway, but the game was driving me crazy. It's beautiful looking, but the platforming, the sort of Celeste-like platforming element was so kind of fussy and demanding that sort of, you have to execute 15 jumps perfectly in a row without making an error, or you have to die and start again, and that kind of stuff drives me mad. So I was really surprised, because that game is such a kind of a beloved game for so many people, seemingly kind of mellow gamer types too, that I was surprised that the difficulty was set so high. So I actually bailed on that one, skipped forward to Will of the Wisps, and I've been having a really good time with it so far. I think I'm 3 hours in. Seems like they've smoothed out some of the issues that bothered me about the first one, but I'm still playing it. I'm still developing my opinion on that game. It's definitely one of the best looking games I've played on Switch, bar none. So I'll be finishing up that review soon, and that will be on Switch Indie Fix probably in the next week or so. So thanks a lot for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can find me on Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, and Instagram, all as Gaming in the Wild. And without wishing to labour the point, I do have a Patreon too. You're welcome there, Gaming in the Wild. So thank you very much for listening. I hope to hear from some of you on Twitter. Let me know what you think of these games. Let me know what you think about Ori and the difficulty level. Let me know what you think about Lost Ember, if you've played it. I always like to hear from people, so you're welcome to tweet at me. I also have a Discord server for the show, so you can hit me up to hear more about that. I'll be back next week with another episode. As always, thanks for listening. Take care of yourselves and each other, and bye-bye for now.